Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our first Comparative Literature Luncheon talk of the academic year. My name is Sydney Abelhassan, and along with my colleague Reiko Tachibana, we are in charge of the luncheons this year. So this is our first year doing this. So we're kind of stumbling along for a little while anyway. But I do want to thank Reiko because she did most of the legwork and the email work on arranging for this visit. First, I want to make a few announcements of our upcoming talks, which I think you will find very interesting. Next Monday, September 18th, we have Angie Krogh from the University of Western Cape, and the talk is entitled Translating Sub-Saharan African Classics. The following week, on September 25th, we have Jane Gallup from the University of Wisconsin. And the topic is Sexuality, Disability, and Aging, Queer Temporalities of the Phallus. And on Monday, October 2nd, we have Alan Golding from the University of Louisville. And his topic is Avant-Gardism Against Itself, Conversation and the Reader Critic in the Little Review. So that's just a little preview of the topics that we have coming up. Does anyone have any announcements they would like to make about upcoming events? All right, if not, I will introduce our own Bob Edwards, who will introduce our distinguished speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you here. Let me start by expressing my thanks to Reiko Tachibana and Sydney Abelhassan for serving as co-coordinators for this year's Comparative Literature Luncheon series. I'm grateful to them for taking on the job of organizing an event that's an important feature of our intellectual community and an occasion to reach beyond the department to friends elsewhere on campus and even far distant places. I want to thank, too, our technical support team, Levy, Sato, Paige Scutieri, and Penny Hartzell. If you want to see our afterlife, thank them. They're videotaping everything. We're very pleased to have Lital Levy as our first speaker in this series this year. Professor Levy did her BA in Middle Eastern and Asian Languages and Cultures at Columbia and a Master of International Affairs at Columbia as well. She completed her PhD in Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley. She's held an appointment as a Harvard Junior Fellow and a Research Fellow, most recently, at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She is currently Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Princeton. Her work is distinguished by an extraordinary willingness to cross disciplinary and discursive boundaries. Her first book, Poetic Trespass, writing between Hebrew and Arabic in Israel-Palestine, was recognized by awards from the Modern Language Association of America, the American Academy for Jewish Research, and the Association for Jewish Studies. It's an ambitious effort to think through language, culture, and history in modern Israel or modern Israeli and Palestinian experience. One that begins, for example, its historical survey with Hebrew Bedouin and Israeli Arabic, and goes on to consider the poetics of misunderstanding, Palestinian midrash, and the act of writing in a language you do not know, or even one that you make up and that doesn't exist. Professor Levy has follow-on projects on Jewish writers in the Arab East, revisions in intellectual and literary history, and the play of temporalities in contemporary Israel and Palestine. Her talk today on Fruitful Symmetries, What Does Equivalence Mean in War and Literature, examines some of the ways we go about making comparisons and drawing inferences from them. Please welcome Lital Levy to Penn State.
Thank you so much for that very Should I stand or sit?
Whatever makes you
Can you all hear me well if I sit? I'm projecting now. So thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here, and especially to be given the slot of your first talk for the year. And I especially want to thank Bob for inviting me, to Reiko in Sydney for organizing everything, and for the really extraordinary hospitality that you've all offered. It's just been an absolute pleasure. And also, I enjoyed dinner last night and meeting with students this morning, and delighted to be here. It's actually my first time at Penn State, so thanks so much for having me. And I think Tom Beebe isn't here, but as long as I'm here, I wanted to say that he published either my first or second article that I ever published when I was still a graduate student, and that really was very important to me in getting a start in my scholarly career. And so, although he's not in the room at the moment, I just wanted to thank him for supporting me and for the work that he does with the journal. I think for a lot of people, comparative literature studies is often their first home for their first scholarly articles, and that is no small thing. Okay, so I'm going to keep those remarks short because I know a lot of people need to leave right at 1 o'clock. I just want to say one more thing, which is that this is a very preliminary paper that's not part of a really developed project at this point, and it is wide open to interventions, suggestions, feedback, revision, decimation. So I can take it. So I'm looking forward to your thoughts afterwards. Okay. In Apocalypse in Solentiname from 1979, Julio Cortázar offers a quasi-autobiographical account of his 1976 visit to the Nicaraguan archipelago Solentiname, where the radical priest Ernesto Cardenal had founded a revolutionary Christian community. There, Cortázar is captivated by the brilliantly colored paintings of local residents, which he photographs with his Polaroid camera. As he relates, quote, "I went through photographing them one by one, positioning myself so that each canvas completely filled the viewer. As luck would have it, there were exactly the same number of paintings as I had shots left, so I could take them all without leaving any out." So in other words, he tells us that there's an absolute correspondence between painting and photograph in both number and scale. Again, as he says, each canvas completely filled the viewer. And he imagines a perfect transfer of each image from original to copy, or if you will, a translation based on perfect equivalence or symmetry between the paintings and the photos. Cortázar returns to Paris, develops the films as slides, and then sits down in his home for a viewing. The first hint of trouble comes when he realizes that his photos from the mass services are distorted because he'd, quote, got the exposure wrong. Then he presses the button on the slide machine, but in the next image, instead of seeing a child playing, he sees a bleeding youth who has been shot dead by an armed officer. Seized by horror, Cortázar compulsively presses the button over and over. Slide after slide elicits visions of unspeakable brutality and suffering, transforming his souvenirs of innocent and rapturous folk art into images of violent political repression, and hence the story's title, Apocalypse in Solentiname. The grotesque interlude is interrupted by the arrival of his companion, Claudine. To Cortázar's astonishment, Claudine looks at the slides and sees only the naive paintings and island scenes. The story has been widely interpreted as a parable about the nature of photographic perception and its relationship to experience, about the optical unconscious, or about the writer as political observer. But I'm interested in reading the story a little bit differently, as a parable about equivalence, translation, and war. In effect, I see this as a cautionary tale about the ghost in the translation machine. The mutation of the images and their failed translation begins with his suggestive reference to faulty exposure. As he keeps pressing the button on the slide projector, the button becomes a trigger, resituating the witness as perpetrator. In what was supposed to be a perfect process of transmission, something has gone terribly awry. As I see it, the ghost in the translation machine is the problem of equivalence. because it's with the assumption of equivalence that his translation breaks down. Somewhere in the process of transfer, the faulty exposure transforms an island paradise into an apocalypse. The staggering asymmetry of power between government perpetrators and civilians exposes and betrays the asymmetries of power that were latent in Cortázar's own original attempt at translation, as he tried to turn Nicaraguan paintings produced for sale to tourists into slides for private visual consumption in his Parisian home. His is a translation that tries but fails to glide seamlessly across economic, cultural, and political lines. Cortázar's brief story evokes the foundational concepts of world literature and cross-cultural translation, while subtly reframing them against the backdrop of asymmetric conflict. With the Polaroid film of the paintings moving from Nicaragua to Paris, we have the movement and circulation into new contexts that characterize world literature. With the correspondence between painting and photos that Cortázar initially assumes, we have the assumptions of commensurability and equivalence in translation. And with the mutation of the images, we have the breakdown of equivalence. In fact, the modern notion of world literature has an endemic connection to war. As we've all probably heard many times, the concept can be traced back to both Goethe and Marx. For Goethe, it expresses an optimism about the Westphalian system that will put an end to Europe's endless wars. For Marx, it's an expression of the cosmopolitanism that arises from global trade. As Ray Chow notes, quote, even in its inception, the notion of a world literature, one that transcends national boundaries, emerged in a historical context in which thinkers were attempting to address and mediate the conflictual, warring political situation within Europe. World literature is thus indebted to the same philosophy that undergirds the classic balance of power theory, which contends that peace is preserved only when an equilibrium of power exists among the great powers, so that strong nations do not attack weaker ones. That latter part was mine, not Ray Chow. Fast forward from Goethe in the 1820s to our situation almost 2 centuries later. Comparative literature, world literature, and translation studies are beset by controversies centered on questions of comparison. Critics contend that the intellectual foundations of these studies assume conditions of equivalence, symmetry, and fungibility, while overlooking the constitutive power dynamics that underscore all acts of comparison. Concurrently, the fields of comparative literature and world literature are becoming increasingly attentive to the interanimation of war and literature. Consider works taking up the war on terror, such as W.J.T. Mitchell's Cloning Terror and Judith Butler's Framing War, or modernist studies' enduring fascination with the First World War, recently foregrounded, for instance, in Paul Saint-Amour's Tense Future, or works like Ray Chow's The Age of the World Target, whose focus is nuclear war, or Jan Miskowski's Watching War, which covers Napoleon through the Cold War. I could go on. There are many such books. Johnny Gambouli's new book as well, Contemporary Global War and the World Novel. Further, it strikes me that other literary critics borrow liberally from a metaphorical language of war. For example, as we see throughout Emily Apter's Translation Zone, in which she invokes the balkanization of language, or a translation no-fly zone, a translation zone at war, and so forth. And similarly, Pascal Casanova describes world literature as a battle waged by peripheral writers for literary recognition and prestige. Indeed, almost, and I mean, these are my terms, but it seems to be kind of gesturing almost like it's a guerrilla insurgency into the Western European cultural motherland. So my desired intervention is to think about how to bring the critiques of comparison into conversation with the insights of a growing body of scholarship on war and literature. And toward these ends, I'm especially interested in using theories of asymmetric conflict as a conceptual lens. At this point, I should explain the relationship between equivalence, symmetry, and comparison. So at least as I'm using these terms, equivalence I see as being the problem with which both comparatists and military theorists are concerned. Now, symmetry is simply one way of describing equivalence. And of course, symmetry also is an aesthetic, sort of formal principle that is applied to poetry and visual art. So I do use the terms symmetry and equivalence somewhat interchangeably, but what I'm actually, the core issue that I'm discussing here is really that of equivalence. Now, to clarify the relationship between comparison and symmetry, comparison itself does not necessarily invoke symmetry, but the notion of symmetry or asymmetry depends on comparison because you can't determine likeness or difference without comparing. So why asymmetric conflict? I'm interested in exploring it as a hermeneutic because I feel that it destabilizes the grounds for comparison and the conditions within which we frame comparison, impelling us to reevaluate all types of equivalence from the comparative moral standing of combatants to the comparative ethics of military strategies. How have scholars of war based in military studies and political science theorized symmetry and equivalence? While notions of symmetry in violence and warfare are as old as literature itself, think an eye for an eye, the term asymmetric warfare was introduced by Andrew Mack in his landmark 1975 article, Why Big Nations Lose Small Wars, which was based largely on his observations of the Vietnam War, in which he contended that, quote, asymmetric conflicts refuted the experience of great power control over the Third World. Mack argued that the disparity in power and military capabilities translated directly to an asymmetry of interest or stakes, in which for belligerents, the war is total, meaning it's a war for survival, while for the metropolitan power, which is his term, by the way, interesting for those of us in literary studies, the war is limited, since full mobilization of resources is not politically possible. Furthermore, in asymmetric conflict, the weaker party's goal is often political in nature. For example, to force the stronger party to end an occupation, to recognize its sovereignty, or to grant it political rights. In contrast to asymmetric conflict, Mack theorizes symmetric war as a total war situation where the survival of both sides is at stake. Such conflicts, he explains, maximize the strategic utility of conventional forms of warfare. So examples of symmetric total wars would be the First and Second World Wars, as well as civil wars in which there is a struggle for national survival. Now, Mack's analysis did not make big inroads at the time he wrote it in the 1970s, but with the end of the Cold War, scholars then rediscovered it. Studies of asymmetric warfare were maturing by the mid-1990s, and following the events of 9/11 and the Iraq War, the threat posed by asymmetric warfare moved to the center of US military thinking and defense policy. As Russia expert Larisa Deribazova explains, the study aims to identify recurring patterns in the post-World War II armed conflicts that involved the great powers. So as she sees it, the emergence of this theory marked an attempt to identify what was seen as a counterintuitive defeat of a great power in a number of armed conflicts with weaker adversaries, which would include a variety of non-state actors. And the strengthening of this trend in the second half of the 20th century and culmination in the early 21st century undermined the logic of the developed states' domination of the periphery and semi-periphery of the world system. Now, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff define asymmetric warfare as, quote, unanticipated or non-traditional approaches to circumvent or undermine an adversary's strengths while exploiting his vulnerabilities through unexpected technological or innovative means. So their definition focuses less on the power differential between the two parties than on the tactics that are employed as compensation. Scholars agree that its history is as old as that of war itself, and written accounts of asymmetric warfare appear as early as the Hebrew Bible. Another scholar, Michael Gross, identifies several types of asymmetric conflict, including wars against occupation, the war on terror, and wars against rogue regimes, and he notes that there are material, legal, and moral dimensions to asymmetric conflict that distinguish it from conventional warfare between two nation-states. Now, what seems particularly significant to me in starting to think about the connections back to literature is that a number of the scholars theorize asymmetric conflict in explicitly Eurocentric terms. So I'll give you some examples now. In 1994, one scholar, T.V. Paul, describes asymmetric warfare as a conflict in which the power differential between two sides leads one side to, quote, develop a strategy and tactics which are in many instances outside the accepted rules of Western warfare. Okay, for Rod Thornton, in his 2007 book, the quote, link that binds different examples together is the element of the West being challenged in a new way by significantly smaller and less powerful entities. Mark Lowther, also in 2007, notes that, quote, the development of asymmetric strategy and tactics took distinctly divergent paths in the East and West. Developing first in China, asymmetric means have long dominated Eastern military theory. The same cannot be said of military theory in the West. Eastern warfare, from its earliest conception in Sun Tzu's Art of War, written in the 5th century BC, to the more recent work of Mao Zedong and Bo Win-Jiep, has long emphasized defeating an adversary without pitched battle. In distinct contrast, Western theorists have long emphasized the significance of a direct collision between opposing armies, end quote. So these culturally essentialist analyses largely follow the clash of civilizations thesis, and they see asymmetric warfare as a kind of anti-normative Eastern strategy. Now, I mentioned the dates of these studies, which again were 1994 and 2 of them in 2007, in order to calibrate them with concurrent developments in literary studies. And probably not coincidentally, the mid-1990s, when the theory of asymmetric conflict matures, is also the period in which post-colonial translation studies gain traction, and the mid-2000s, when the studies of asymmetric conflict move to the center of policy interest. That corresponds with the first big wave of world literature scholarship. Now, world literature, transnational literary scholarship, and theories of alternative modernity are all indebted, at least in part, to world systems theory and to the post-Cold War reconceptualization of globality. And all of this is also what predicates the theorization of asymmetric warfare. So if symmetric or conventional warfare is construed as that which takes place between two Western nations, and asymmetric warfare is a confrontation between East and West, then the obvious, if perhaps facile, correspondence to literary studies concerns the translational encounter between East and West, which has also been theorized as asymmetric, and also in some cases studies as an effect of warfare. For example, in Shadden-Tageldin's 2011 book, Disarming Words. So although I don't have time to really describe it, I'm interested in translational warfare in the Israeli-Palestinian context, which I can tell you about more in the discussion. So let's now return to critical theory to see how some studies of comparison engage questions of war and asymmetry. And here I utilize Ray Chow's book, The Age of the World Target, which I mentioned, which is from 2006, Michael Rothberg's 2009 Multidirectional Memory, and Gayatri Spivak's essay, Rethinking Comparison, from the 2013 volume on comparison that was edited by Rita Felsky and Susan Stanford Friedman. So Chow lambasts comparative literary studies for relying on an assumption of equivalence or parity between language and literary traditions. Quote, she says, as part of a cluster of concepts that sees linguistic cosmopolitanism and the peaceful coexistence of national and cultural traditions as its telos, comparison in comparative literature is understandably grounded in the notion of parity. Yet, as she reminds us, quote, languages and cultures almost never enter the world stage and encounter one another on an equal footing, but rather they embed relations of dominance. So for Chow, quote, the notion of parity inscribed in comparison would need to be recognized perhaps as a form of utopianism that tends to run aground in practice, end quote. Now, Spivak and Rothberg, however, they both view the act of comparison as one that necessarily implies judgment or ranking, rather than the assumption of equivalence or sameness. Rothberg is interested in the politics of comparison in a different sense than Chow, whereas for Chow, the political aspect of comparison has everything to do with multilingualism and the sort of contest of power between languages. Rothberg delves into the affective logic of comparison versus equation. So for him, equation between different experiences of victimhood runs along a kind of axis between competition on one end and solidarity on the other. And he's mainly interested in questions of moral equivalence. So he discusses the imperative to develop an ethics of comparison that would coordinate the asymmetrical claims of victims. Okay, so in other words, he assumes a condition of asymmetry, and then he's trying to work through the ethics of comparison within that framework, where there's a fundamental understanding that, yes, it is asymmetrical. Now, to move on to Spivak, like Chow, Spivak pushes back against comparison as a discovery of varieties of sameness. But, like Rothberg, she also connects comparison and asymmetry to the affective positions of identification and empathy. So she argues that, as a translator or a comparatist, you must relate to every language as though you yourself inhabit it, and approach translation as a practice of embodiment. So where Rothberg thinks about competitive victimhood, Spivak turns to comparison and equivalence to theorize individual acts of politically motivated brutality. In her reading of Shun Mendoruma's 1999 short story, Hope, which takes up the murder of an American child as revenge for a U.S. Marine's rape of Okinawan girls, Spivak understands the eye for an eye type of equivalence as the moral accounting of the disenfranchised. She argues for viewing it as a kind of comparison in extremis, that's her term, in which the terrorist resorts to extreme measures as, quote, a plea to the political other to recognize equivalence, to respond, and finally to end oppression. Now, Spivak's reading here comports directly with the theory of asymmetric warfare, which interprets the goal of non-state belligerence as political in exactly this sense. And I think right here Spivak is doing the work of theorizing comparison in literature and war as embedded within the social context of asymmetric warfare. And further, she instantiates my argument that asymmetric conflict essentially breaks down the frame of comparison, catalyzing us to rethink equivalence in many dimensions. All that said, what would theories of asymmetry look like if written neither by the Joint Chiefs of Staff nor by US-based literary and cultural critics? That is, if it were theorized by insurgents outside the centers of imperial power. So I have not yet been able to research this question across different cultures, but I can offer just some conjectures from the Middle East. And I believe that to a large extent, this question has to be situated within the particular group's epistemology and understanding of time, space, and history. So for example, not that I have a means of confirming this, but I would guess that the Islamic State doesn't see itself as being in a post-Cold War moment, much as the Joint Chiefs of Staff do. So rather, it fancies itself as fighting an epochal battle that's been ongoing since the Crusades. Right? So if you don't share the time and space of your opponent, then you've undermined the very basis for comparison that facilitates any theorization of the power differential. So on this level, I'm not sure that they necessarily see themselves as being in the less powerful side of an asymmetric equation. But we can contrast ISIS with the more secular temporality of the resistance to the Israeli occupation as presented, for example, throughout Hani Abu Assad's 2005 film Paradise Now about two would-be suicide bombers in the West Bank. So here I have a very short clip that I'm going to show in which Suha, who is in the film The Western Educated Human Rights Advocate, she tries to deter Khalid, one of the two would-be suicide bombers, from his mission. And you'll see how they use this language of equivalence. So let's hope that everything, it might take the computer like a second to wake back up, but everything should be set up. Oh, I need to get rid of this. Okay.
شو سبكم؟ ليش بتعملوا هيك؟
ما عادش في خيار تاني. ما نقدرش نتكافئ بالحياة نتكافئ بالموت.
إذا عندك القدرة على إنه تموت وتقتل من شأن تكافؤ، ليش بدوش على إمكانية الحياة عشان تعيش تكافؤ كمان؟
كيف؟ منظمة حقوق الإنسان تبعتك؟
هاي واحدة من الإمكانيات. عقائد هيك ممنوعة للإسرائيلية عذر إنهم يضلوا يقتلوا فينا.
والله العظيم إنك عنياتك. مش حرية بدون كفاح. لازم حدا يضحي بحاله، طول ما في ظلم واحتلال في تضحية.
هذا مش تضحية، هذا انتقام. هيك بتقتل وبتسزيهم وببدل في الفرق بين الضحية والقتل.
الفرق انه بطل في عنا خيارات ثانية كيف الناضل، يفتحوا لنا مجالات ثانية ضرر، لو في عنا طيارات يعملوا كل شيء على استشهاديين.
الفرق الوحيد انه اسرائيل اقوى بكثير عسكريا وانت مش قوي اتهم.
كان خلينا نكون متساويين بالموت، دائما راح يكون عندنا الجنة باذن الله.
Okay. So here, Suha, the human rights worker, argues that the fundamental condition of asymmetry in military capability between the resistance and the Israeli army means that military tactics should be abandoned altogether as the mode of resistance and struggle. Whereas Khaled, the would-be suicide bomber, he reiterates Spivak's whole theory of comparison in extremis as a desperate measure of reestablishing equality, which is the term that they're using, or in other words, equivalence. And I think that the sort of move from equivalence to equality is, through the sort of human rights lens that the Suha character brings to it. So the same logic is reiterated at the end of the film when the other would-be bomber reaffirms his decision to carry out the bombing, telling his recruiter, they, meaning Israel, must understand that if there's no security for us, there'll be none for them either. It's not about power. Their power doesn't help them. I tried to deliver this message to them, but I couldn't find another way. So in the film, at least, the characters represent two different responses to the problem of political and military asymmetry, while subscribing to the logic of being in a zero-sum conflict that is tied to a current geopolitical moment in which both sides sort of see themselves as being in the same moment. So to conclude, I've offered some outlines for a transdisciplinary conceptualization of comparison, equivalence, and symmetry involving conflict and its discursive effects. And the analogy that I've suggested in this paper between asymmetric warfare and comparative or translational discursive practices could be extended in a few different directions. Proxy wars in asymmetric situations might be analogous to some situations of indirect translation. Population exchange also raises questions of equivalence and fungibility that can be productively juxtaposed with translation studies. In future work, I hope to use this juxtaposition to move beyond questions of representing war or viewing and witnessing war toward an interrogation of the epistemologies of power that present themselves in our understandings of both war and literature. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tom. We have plenty of time for questions. Normally we end at 1:30, but we're going to end a little bit earlier today, maybe 5 minutes, so that Lital can catch her transportation back to Philadelphia. So, what questions do we have? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
A question that's mostly about methodology. So you started off by giving us this nice kind of top-down notion of the major concepts you were working with and how they might kind of play out, and then ended with a precise example. I guess my methodology question is asking you to flip that and to reflect a little bit. I mean, I know you're at the beginning of the project, but to reflect a little bit on how it is, if what you're trying to get at is the non-Cold War or counterinsurgent narrative of things, right? How are you going to get to those filmic or literary types of examples from which to build these alternate models of comparison and equitability?
How am I going to get to the examples? I'm just
Where do you
keep
go?
looking for them.
Well, so I mean, so just thinking about the case of Merudo Mashun, for instance, right?
Yeah.
So if you're in Okinawa, then and you're looking at Merudo Mashun, that's someone who is, as an Okinawan, writing in Japanese, which is a colonial language in many ways, but has become kind of the local language. And he's also, at this point, writing for a self-consciously translated audience outside of Japan. So to what extent, how do you begin to situate that as kind of a, how do you not fall into the endless authenticity trap, right?
The endless, sorry, I didn't hear.
Authenticity trap?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, the examples that, I mean, At this point, I don't even know to what extent I would be looking for work outside of my own area of expertise, but the sort of other parts, little pieces that I've been working with are actually in languages that I myself work in. So I haven't been terribly concerned about that because, for instance, I mean, I was looking at propaganda videos put out by Hamas for consumption by Israelis. I don't think there's necessarily an authenticity concern there. Or, I mean, I guess it's sort of a question of who the audience is and what the aim is. And I'm looking at so far, I mean, very, very different types of texts. Another one is, Waltz with Bashir, which is a commercial film that is made for international exposure very consciously, but you sort of take that into account as you're analyzing it. So yeah, it's a great question, but I think at this point, the work that I'm doing, just because of the fact that I myself am coming from literary studies, is still trying to understand what this means for military theorists. And once I have a firmer grasp of that and sort of understanding any kind of connections that I see between the way, because some of it is also kind of a rehistoricization of the critical theory itself, as I kind of tried to do a little bit, like trying to understand how world literature and comparative literature have been influenced by, world systems theory, and at the same time so has, a lot of political theory and military studies. So there's that aspect of it, but going back to the actual textual examples, I guess, that's one of the questions that I'll have to think through, but I'm actually not really at that stage yet. I'm still at the stage of conceptualization, so thanks for, raising my, I'll keep thinking about that and go back.
I had a question that kind of stems from an offhand comment that you said that, of course, they don't view themselves as less powerful. And then in this final clip here, the quote, I think, underneath the AT&T advertisement is, well, at least we have, or we still have paradise. So the way I'm connecting these two things is precisely that I think the normal state of war is this state in which people are willing to fight.
Yeah.
And therefore, is not a perceived state of necessarily asymmetry for those playing, but the reality is always, all wars are always wars of asymmetry.
Yeah.
So, and in the same way that all reading is always comparison.
Right.
And therefore, kind of taking your starting point from these definitions of asymmetric war seems like a kind of straw man. That is to say, in the same way that taking statements about comparative literature, it seems like something of a straw man. That it seems like you're setting yourself up for kind of strange ontologies. That is when. And kind of circular logic that's going to, in a sense, just kind of prove what you're setting out to prove from the beginning. And that's I like the idea of equivalence and asymmetry and translation and comparison being brought together. That was rhetorically very enticing for me. But as I'm trying to tease out where this is going, I can't but see it kind of being a snake eating its own tail because of this sort of problem of these very definitions are so slippery, and it really depends on what your points of attention are, or what ontologies you're comfortable with are. That's the sticking point for me as I'm trying to tease out your idea.
No, I think that's right. I just want a minor clarification. These are the figures who do see themselves as less powerful.
Right, but we still have paradise as a gesture towards we have something they don't have.
That's true.
Right, and therefore, and at least they may have planes, they may have this, they may have that, but we have paradise.
That's true. Right. I think your point is very well taken, and the truth is that's sort of the same question that I'm struggling with here. I mean, I think that again, sort of, the point is not necessarily to arrive at an answer where you say, aha, like this is sort of going to give us a way out of the impasse of comparison, because comparison itself is a sort of inherently circular problem in exactly the way that you've described. but I think that understanding when we're talking about asymmetry so much in, trying to do this work of problematizing comparison, I think that the potentially productive aspect of it is, because we are talking about power, why not look at where people are actually theorizing power in the real world? You know what I'm saying? Like, we're so kind of obsessed in literary studies with the relationship of power, but at a sort of, level of remove. And it just sort of, well, how are people dealing with problems of comparison and symmetry when they're literally theorizing war and conflict? And then what you find is that, again, a lot of the, maybe not surprisingly, but a lot of the thinking is kind of inflected with the same sort of Eurocentrisms, and sort of cultural essentializations that we have at least done the work of trying to identify and dismantle in Comp Lit. In some sense, I think, comparative cultural studies is at least self-aware about this. So, I mean, on some level, it's not necessarily looking for answers as much as it's a kind of discourse, comparative discourse analysis. But, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Like, all of these terms are very slippery, and the problem with comparison itself is that it can mean very different things depending on whether you're comparing for similarity or comparing for difference. And that was sort of what I was trying to say with looking at Ray Chow versus Spivak versus Rothberg in discussing, problems of comparison. Comparison means something very different for each one of them. So yeah, I mean, I take your point very much. I'm not sure in the end, like, how this is, what direction it's going to go, and this is very, very preliminary, but I think that there is something potentially that in some ways it could, the conversation between the military theorization and the cultural studies could open up some kind of space that could help us in, especially with world literature, I think, start to understand how do these theoretical concerns play out, or how can we look at them in sort of the social world, rather than just sort of in the abstract. And that's what I'm interested in. But I don't know at this point where it's going to lead me either. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on a kind of subtext of some of the examples that you gave specifically with the Islamic State and Hamas, and even the Paradise Now example, which has to do with the question of the theological imagination, right? So, for example, questions of equilibrium, balance, and justice would mean a very different thing within a kind of Islamic esteem. And I'm wondering, and as you sort of pointed out, even the life now versus the afterlife, right? There's all these sort of questions of kind of temporality that I think really implicate what equilibrium, balance, and justice might mean within a particular context, and specifically within the context of holy war.
Holy war,
so, So I'm wondering maybe if that's a sort of component of how you're approaching this.
Well, it would be. I mean, again, like this, the first, so there's several different parts of this. So, one is, what are military theorists saying? That's, again, like that's a big area that I'm just sort of approaching. The second, which is what I start with, is what are the cultural theorists saying about symmetry? And then, the last piece of the puzzle would be, how does ISIS understand symmetry, right? And that's more difficult because it's harder to get access to text that would give you an indication of how they understand this. So, and again, this is to what extent Hani Abu Assad is, accurately representing, off-the-cuff conversation between a human rights worker and a would-be suicide bomber. I mean, that's the screenwriter's imagination of this. So I don't want to assume that there's some kind of mimetic relationship to some, reality. But I mean, that's exactly my point, is that all of the sort of what the theorizations by the Joint Chiefs of Staff have in common with Gayatri Spivak, as absurd as that sounds, is that they're both at least being theorized within a sort of shared assumption, temporal and spatial and political assumption of, where we are in this sort of moment, the post-Cold War moment, the late capitalist moment, whatever you want to call it. And that was my point, which is that that's not the assumption necessarily, of ISIS. So the question of holy war as like an alternative to total war or partial war is a great one. I hadn't thought about it as such, thanks for that contribution, but just sort of off the cuff, I would say that in some ways it would be more analogous to a total war situation, right? Where it's a war it's an ultimate war for survival, you know? And I think the difference is maybe just that the stakes are not simply political in the sort of statist, you know, post-Westphalian sense, but it's theological and political, right? But at least in terms of what it means for the party that's fighting and how it sees itself, yeah, I mean, again, maybe we need to revisit this whole notion of, you know, like I said, they don't necessarily see themselves as the weaker party. If you're fighting a holy war and you have paradise, then yes, you have something that your opponent doesn't have. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So thank you for that talk. That was really interesting. And I love the image with which you sort of began the talk of this photographer coming home, right, and trying to sort through his photos and finding something there that he didn't intend to produce in the photo or didn't recognize as being there until he sort of reviews them afterwards, right? It's kind of like this sort of the way that representation or what he thinks is representation is sort of interrupted, this kind of scene of violence, right, that makes itself kind of visible through his text or through his photos. And so you said something about this turning him from a sort of witness into, I believe, a perpetrator, something like this, so this sort of moment in which he goes from being a kind of disengaged or sort of dispassionate or maybe disinterested, right, critic of this art object and then becomes somehow perpetrated, or becomes sort of implicated, right, in the perpetration of something different that wasn't what he intended. So I'm wondering if you can kind of bring this back a little bit more explicitly to the comparison with the translator. If the translator is in the position of the artist or the photographer in your sort of opening scene that you gave us, then how does this kind of moment in which, maybe where is the moment in translation in which the translator sort of has this recognition of the asymmetry in the work and is kind of horrified by it or has this kind of reaction to it? If he sort of recognizes this in a way that the kind of more the non-implicated viewer doesn't, right? You said in the sort of the story, the friend or something, right, doesn't see the horror in the images the translator comes to recognize. So I'm just wondering if you can just say a little bit more about the figure of the translator, I guess, even in this kind of larger sort of chart of or constellation of ideas that you're suggesting.
Well, I mean, there's been a huge body of work on, you know, post-colonial translation theory, so I feel like it's been said in a sense, right? And on the other hand, there's also, you know, like I said, Spivak comes up with a very different sort of empathetic idea of the translator, you know, as having sort of like the affective relationship where you have to kind of reinvent the mother tongue kind of, you know, feeling language. So, I mean, I think that my reading of Cortázar corresponds more to kind of the pre-theorized, you know, sort of translation. Again, like the violence that's done is because of the assumption of equivalence. I think once you have like the self-awareness of the asymmetry, that helps in some way to, the awareness itself might not completely do away with the violence, but it certainly, you know, can aid with it. You try to sort of move yourself towards the more empathetic sort of, you know, embodied position suggested by Spivak. So, you know, I mean, basically the idea is that he doesn't have, the reason that it breaks down is because he assumes the fungibility and the perfect transfer without sort of recognizing his own position as a mediator and thinking about what that brings to it, and it catches him sort of unaware. So that was the idea. And the perpetrator, I mean, the way that the story brings it out metaphorically is through his pressing the button, right? It's like the trigger. Every time he presses the button, the next figure dies, basically. And so, you know, sure, he's not literally the one who's doing it, but it seems to suggest that it's putting him almost like in the position of the, you know, whoever it is, the officer or whatever who's doing the killing. So it's not so much that I'm coming up with some new, you know, theory of the violence of translation, because that's been discussed to death. It's just that I'm sort of taking that recognition and saying, yes, we understand that there's a certain violence in translation, And we also understand that there's a violence in comparison, and saying, let's look at actual, violence and look at how people have been dealing with that. Does that mean that all translation is, violent? I mean, no, like that's an exaggeration, but just, again, that we're dealing with this question of the asymmetries of power that are endemic to any cross-cultural translation, trying to understand that. I really particularly admire a few books dealing with cross-cultural translation. I love Lydia Liu's work. She's great. Of course, citing translation, Tejas Luncheon is one of the, it's like sort of almost a foundational text for this. So again, I mean, I feel like it's building on those approaches.
Well, I wanted to ask a question that's a little bit speculative based on a concept that occurred to me as you were talking that's adjacent to the idea of asymmetrical conflict, and I don't think sort of transfers quite into the questions you're asking, but I'm interested in it, which is the principle of deterrence. So the idea of mutually, so to go to Cold War concepts, right?
Yeah.
So mutually assured nuclear destruction, one is deterred from using one's nuclear weapons, and instead you have proxy conflicts, many of which will be asymmetrical. And then the rise of theorization of asymmetrical conflict post-Cold War is a sort of realization of the failure of deterrence as a principle, right? You can't ever be strong enough or threatening enough to really deter insurgency.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That was what one of the people I quoted was saying. That's why it seems so counterintuitive to them.
But it feels like a word, but it doesn't have, a translation into the kind of questions you're asking about comparison, right? So what would be the translation of the principle of deterrence in military context into the kind of literary questions of comparison? I don't know. And precisely because of that, I find it interesting. So I'm wondering if you've thought about it. And
I haven't thought about deterrence at all, but I will. I mean, this is very preliminary, so, I mean, basically, in terms of the theorization of asymmetry, I mean, what I've given you is what I have of this, and then I have some other work that has to do with Holocaust comparisons in the context of Israel-Palestine, and translation, like I said, of, Hamas propaganda videos into Hebrew in the context of war, so I'm interested in translation and more, but I haven't really done, more work in terms of thinking of all the various ways you could spin this out into, deterrence or anything. But I mean, I think that, the idea is not necessarily to say like everything in asymmetric conflict is going to have some direct relationship to what we do with language, right? But again, I think that even asking these questions and thinking about it can be productive and useful. So, the point, though, is that ultimately, I guess the main difference is that in the field of war, you don't want to have that encounter. The whole point is to prevent it from happening in the first place. Whereas in cultural studies and translation, we want to have the encounter, right? We just want it to occur in a way that is, as least violent as possible, or at least to recognize the underlying violence when it occurs, or the asymmetries or what have you. So deterrence might not work because it's not that we're necessarily actively seeking to keep languages and cultures separate from each other, but we could think of sort of what deterrence implies in terms of conceptualizing, again, sort of parity and equivalence and sameness, and the fact that for deterrence to work, you have to have this balance of power, right? And yet, as somebody said, all conflict and all war and all comparison is ultimately going to, it's never going to be exactly equal. And contact does, I mean, any form of contact involves some kind of unequal, power exchange. So, so I mean, I know I haven't really answered the question about like what would be the analogy for deterrence. I don't know, I'd have to think about it more, but I mean, I'm sure if you looked for it hard enough, you could find some way of finding examples where people actually resist translation. I mean, maybe, Kilito's "Thou shalt not translate" would be some sort of, where he resists translation precisely because of the power inequities, for those of you who are familiar, right? Like he finds it to be really troubling when a foreigner speaks his language. That might maybe be related to deterrence in some way. But thank you, I'll think about Detroit, this is interesting.
Thank you very much. It is very interesting to hear about the asymmetrical condition for the representation where you are trying to juxtapose. I'm thinking about the North Korean case here because if you look at North Korean text, they are actually translating the asymmetric power in reality into equivalence. So they actually have won the war because they haven't been defeated.
Yes.
So there is like in between status for them, there is a liminality. They are claiming about like there is something else beyond the victory and the loss, or there is something else beyond the war for survival. It is a tactic for them, both militarily and symbolically. So in this case, actually, it opens up a different space for us to think about the whole distinction between the Cold War and the post-Cold War, or the coloniality. Actually, their way of thinking, the Cold War era, has been embedded in the colonial imagination. So without thinking that history, it is actually very hard for us to imagine the logic of the so-called propaganda literature for us. But internally, that kind of reversal, the reversal of asymmetry in reality to equivalence in their imagination.
Right.
It is their reality.
What temporality do they see themselves as how they, you know what I mean? Like how would they see their moment in time? What kind of time frame is it for them if it's not like post-Cold War?
Yeah, from the Japanese colonial period, the liberation space to the Cold War. So the Korean War itself was very complicated because there was a division, but it became a proxy war for the Cold War. So in this case, actually, the binary between the symmetry and asymmetry actually doesn't work. So there was like asymmetrical power arriving on the Korean Peninsula, but there is symmetrical division within the nation.
I see. Thank you, that's really useful.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, let us give a thank you to our speaker, Lital Levy, and wish her a lovely trip back to Philadelphia. Thank you.